Warning, this video contains flashing bright lights that may cause some discomfort. I've done everything in my power to mitigate this as best as I could, but it still might be a bit of an issue for some, so just letting you know that now.
What happened?
That's what I'd like to know. 2022 seems to be quite the year for gaming, with big releases like Elden Ring, Horizon Zero Dawn, LEGO Star Wars, and of course, Big Kerbo. So with that being said, my most anticipated game of the year was a budget remake of an arcade game from the 90s. I'm not joking. You have no idea how earth-shattering this game's announcement was to me in 2021. I cared more about this game than Zelda, and I do enjoy me a good Zelda. After not hearing anything more for a while and getting a bit of a silent delay, the day that I've been personally waiting for at least, I don't know, a decade, my favorite arcade game of all time has finally made its triumphant return. Well, sort of. The House of the Dead Remake, as the name suggests, is a remake of the classic arcade light gun shooter game from 1996-7, and this remake's existence is a very big deal. For those who don't know, the source code of the original game was lost, and the only home console versions that we ever got of the original game were inferior to say the least. Because of this, the original game has never been faithfully brought over to any home consoles, at least not in its original form. And finding an original unit in the wild is like trying to find a video on this channel that has more views on it than my previous House of the Dead video. Holy shit, did you guys show up in droves to support that one? I honestly didn't think many people cared about this franchise. So, thanks. Please check out that video before watching this one, as I think it gives a lot of background to my overall feelings towards this franchise, and it gives us a little bit of insight into where we're currently at. So yeah, clearly I'm not the only person who's been dying to get their hands on this game. It didn't seem like Sega had much interest in doing much with this franchise, especially as far as the first game was concerned, yet this is real. I still can't believe that this thing actually exists given how little attention the House of the Dead gets. Our community is small, but the anticipation was, well, it was kind of mixed to be honest. Leading up to this game's release, there were a number of things that had me and a lot of other fans concerned. It was simultaneous hype and dread, along with morbid curiosity that kept me anxiously waiting for this game's release day. Well, the wait is finally over, and as surreal as it is, I can now finally answer this question. Does the House of the Dead remake live up to the original? Well, it's complicated. Let's get into it. The House of the Dead remake is a from-the-ground-up reimagining of the original game, developed by Forever Entertainment and Megapixel Studios, a subsidiary of Forever Entertainment, who previously worked on the Panzer Dragoon remake, another instance of Sega licensing out one of their classic games to this smaller studio. This was kind of the only way that this original game could have ever possibly had the chance to see the light of day. Because the original source code of the game was lost, rebuilding this game from the ground up was really the only choice that was available. Forever Entertainment didn't work on the original game, and this relatively small team had the project licensed to them by Sega to be brought over to the Nintendo Switch, with the potential to eventually see it be brought over to other platforms in the future. So because of this history, my expectations with this remake were a bit different from the expectations that I have for other remakes or reimaginings. Because you can't own the original arcade game in its original form unless you decide to shell out thousands of dollars for an arcade cabinet, this remake is essentially the only option for playing this game. So my expectations were for the game to be as faithful as possible, as this would essentially be replacing the original arcade version. So let's take a look at how they did. What we have here is a pretty faithful recreation of the original game, reimagined with modern graphics and updated controls to suit the absence of an old CRT TV and light gun combination. The level layouts are pretty much identical when compared to the original game, and enemy placement and patterns are also quite faithful to the original. Since this game was built from the ground up in the Unity engine, it's not an exact one-to-one setup compared to the original. No, in fact, there are a lot of differences, graphical updates aside. In my last House of the Dead video, I talked about the secret recipe. In other words, the 3 core pillars that make the House of the Dead games good in my eyes. And you know, we have 3 ingredients here, but the 3 ingredients to this recipe are the core reasons why I was kind of let down by this game. Okay, let's get into it. Ingredient number 1, controlling the goddamn game. The biggest elephant in the room is all about how the game controls. How do you do that? Well, as expected, gyroscope aiming and analog sticks are the two primary options. Analog control is about as much fun as you'd expect it to be, but motion controls? Yeah, that was the thing everybody was wondering about. And you know, after a bit of tweaking and adjusting, I think it feels just like playing the original game while your younger sibling or cousin is trying to take the controller out of your hand. Let's be frank, the default settings are not very good. You're gonna have to do a lot of tweaking and messing with the controls before you even get decent settings, but I mean, even after you do, the cursor can and will drift. You're gonna constantly miss shots and have to hit Y to recenter. Eventually, I started playing mostly with the analog stick because it was just much more reliable, only using motion controls to make larger movements that I wouldn't be able to make with the stick very quickly. This is a big thing to start discussing right off the bat, but it's an important aspect of the game, and missing shots because your cursor doesn't want to do your bidding just takes away from the fun of the experience. Using the Joy-Cons feels most like pointing a gun, but that setup is easily the least reliable. Pro Controller with stick and gyro simultaneously, along with tweaked settings, is the best way to go in my opinion, but even then, it doesn't feel very good. Honestly, this cursor just wants to get the fuck out of this game, and I don't blame it. In preparation for this game, I played the original with both a mouse, and I've also got a lot of experience playing with the light gun, and when it comes to the original game, I can pretty easily get through the entire thing on a single credit, but here, I get hit at least, 4 or 5 times as much, and it was so bad that on my very first playthrough, I burned through all 10 plus credits and died at the final boss. My memory of the original was definitely useful for this experience, and every camera move, enemy, room, and alternate route was accounted for, but even with that knowledge, the controls really made playing this game difficult. Just getting a run where I was able to save all the scientists took way longer than I wanted to, and by the time I was done doing that, I just wasn't having a whole lot of fun. So these control options just aren't doing a whole lot of good, and when it comes to portable mode, I thought, hey, it would be really cool if we could have touchscreen support and we could tap the zombies. There's no touchscreen support. But okay, I think we've said everything that we need to say about the controls. Ingredient number 2. All about that aesthetic, baby. At an artistic level, I think I really like what they were trying to go for here. Seeing the classic environments reimagined in a brand new engine is really cool and fleshes out rooms that used to be empty and really cardboard looking, but at the same time, this game is really struggling on the Nintendo Switch. For starters, pop-in. The pop-in in this game is very bad. In the opening cutscene, the very first thing that you see is pop-in, and it was the very first thing I noticed, and it was very distracting. This is followed up with the very first enemy kind of popping into position, along with the lights changing. The original game was a lot smoother here. This is also compounded by the lighting also popping into place, along with the lower resolution that I think is about 720p, just kind of making everything look gross in motion. We also have so-so textures and really bad shadows. These are all aesthetic things, of course, and they kind of ignore the biggest problem that I have with the game, which is how it runs. This frame rate is awful. So the game offers a normal mode and a performance mode. Visually, the two are almost identical, but performance mode is supposed to get us to a target of 60 frames a second. And you know, this happens like 20% of the time. This is easily the worst performance mode I've ever experienced in a game, and most of the game was chugging and fluctuating so much that it was actively affecting my ability to play the game. When you combine inconsistent frame rate with inconsistent gyro controls, I feel like I'm one of the f***ing zombies. Portable mode seems to run better, but it's still susceptible to a lot of the same issues. To compound on the issue even further, the camera motions are a lot jankier than they were previously. Yeah, the camera just loves to whip around and snap and move every which way, kinda similar to House of the Dead Overkill's camera. But when I'm trying to shoot at zombies, this is just really annoying. Again, compared to the original, the camera moves smoothly, enemies have consistent patterns, and the frame rate is stable at 60 frames per second. In this new game, the camera is jerky, enemy animations are also sometimes jerky, the camera constantly pans around to focus on each enemy, which leads to me misfiring a lot of the time, and this frame rate also makes me feel like I'm playing Star Fox on the Super Nintendo. Also, unlike the original game, you can take damage from enemies that aren't even on screen. So this is all really unfortunate. I would have vastly preferred less graphical fidelity if it meant having a smoother and more consistent frame rate. I also don't like the way some of these enemies move. Some patterns were changed, making them harder to hit than they were in the original. The issue of getting hit by enemies that aren't even on screen is a lot more prominent in the brand new Horde mode. Another interesting thing to note was that the original game was set in a 4:3 aspect ratio. Meanwhile, this new game is dummy thick in glorious 16:9. But even with this extra screen real estate, you still end up getting hit by a bunch of bullshit, so that's fun. All of these issues aside, I generally like the way this game was updated to look. The only artistic details that bother me personally are the way some of the human character models look and just the look of the starting area on the whole. This red hue is kind of a huge deviation from how the original game looked, and I gotta say, I didn't really like it very much. I also don't like what they did with certain enemies, where in the original game, you had the option to choose between red or green blood, plus a few other options, and the flesh color of certain zombies would change to match. Here, most enemies that would have had red coloring on their exterior are green for some reason, but they still spurt red blood when you shoot them. This is the broccoli man. Okay, well, before I wrap up this section, I do have one positive thing to say here, which is the way that zombies fall apart. House of the Dead 4 and Scarlet Dawn had enemies vaporizing into the ether, so I'm glad that we've made the return to chunky severed limbs and crisp gunshot sounds. They even added in a ragdoll system, which took a while for me to get used to, but it's kind of fun. Although it does look a little goofy when enemies just kind of disappear like that. I don't know why, that just looks kind of weird. The ragdoll physics can be fun, but they do have a tendency to disrupt the pacing, and that kind of reminds me of the House of the Dead 3, and how in that game, enemies could continue to be shot even after they were technically dead. There are also loading screens in between the levels, which kind of kill the mood a little bit. They take a decent chunk of time. So when you account for that, how much longer it takes for enemies to go down, and also the way that cutscenes were kind of extended, you end up with a game that's about 4 to 5 minutes longer, which is almost the length of an entire extra level in this game. Ingredient number 3, raving and vibing with the spooky, scary skeletons. The ASMR in this game is kind of off the charts. You even hear Rogan stepping around all willy-nilly. The gunshot sounds in this game are pretty crisp, but I would still say that I prefer the sounds of the original game. Speaking of sound, we have to talk about the voice acting, which intentionally stays true to the voice acting from the original game.
Others are still inside. Save them. Others are still inside. Save them.
You must stop Curian, or else something terrible will happen.
You must stop Curian, or else something terrible will happen.
I must compliment you. I didn't think you could make it this far.
I must compliment you. I didn't think you could make it this far.
It's cheesy and still goofy overall. They even made Rogan and G a bit more badass by expanding on these cutscenes. Now Rogan spins his gun and I'm like, oh, he's kinda cool. Although, Rogan, if you hadn't fucked around at the beginning of the game, you could have easily saved this guy's life. Like, you realize that, right? Also, why is this guy holding a picture of the other scientists? I mean, I get that he did that in the original game, but like, he's like putting it up in your face. Well, now it's time for me to address the other elephant in the room, the game's soundtrack. After all, the original soundtrack was one of my favorite things about that game, and is a defining quality that's crucial to the game's identity. It's still my favorite soundtrack in the entire series, and I was excited for this remake to come out and for more people to have the opportunity to hear some of these bangers. After all, when you're playing this in an arcade where a bunch of children are screaming left and right, you can't exactly hear the finer details of why Revenge is a masterclass in being a certified hood classic. So how do these new remixes sound? They don't exist. No, instead we have a completely original soundtrack that takes loose inspiration from the arcade classic. These are brand new tracks. From my understanding, there were some legal issues getting the rights to the original tracks, and I think some people that worked on the game said that they could have done it, but it was much easier to not worry about legal issues and to just work on a brand new original soundtrack. At least given my understanding of the situation, that's the reasoning that we have. So yeah, I booted up the first level and I heard this. And I was like, that's not tragedy. The new songs threw me off at first, and I really wasn't feeling them. Going into this game, knowing that the original soundtrack was replaced, it was probably one of the biggest blows to my anticipation of the game. This is some George Lucas editing CGI into the classic Star Wars trilogy levels of undoing things that fans were very happy with. Now, it should be said that I do not blame anyone on the dev team for this change. I think this is more so an issue with management rather than the people developing and working on the game. It's not the creative's fault. And if I'm being completely honest, after a good handful of playthroughs, the new tracks aren't really all that bad. Once I got past how out of place they felt at first, I kind of started to really appreciate some of the new tracks. In particular, the tracks that play during chapters 1 and 2, bits of 3, and parts of the new Magician theme. Now, none of these tracks are on the same level as the original soundtrack, and sometimes they do kind of sound like knockoffs that are really trying hard not to get copyrighted. But aside from some of these weird hiccups here and there, the soundtrack is pretty good. And honestly, if this was the soundtrack to a brand new House of the Dead game, I would say that this is the best soundtrack we've gotten since House of the Dead 2. But unfortunately, this isn't a new House of the Dead. This is a remake. And without that original music, this does not feel like the same game. Just to see how it would change my perception, I decided to do a little experiment. So I turned the volume all the way down, brought this over into Premiere Pro, and edited the original tracks into the game. And you know, I think the game feels much better this way. You can click the card or check the link in the video description to see the video that I made of this, or you can visit Trex45's channel and watch his video where he edits his remixed House of the Dead tracks. Yeah, he remixed the original tracks and they fit very well, I gotta say. So again, I like these new tracks, and I 100% agree that these composers are talented and they should be brought on to work on more stuff in the future. My biggest problem with this new soundtrack just stems from the change. Hello there. Welcome to Music Corner, where I break down the music for a hot little second. You can skip ahead to the timestamp if you don't want to watch this bit. But why would you do that when you could listen to me talk about music? Could you back up a little bit, please? I'm getting a little uncomfortable. That's better. So it all starts with the music that you hear on the main menu. The arcade original has this gothic, big, epic feel to it. The remake sounds Halloween-y, but in a more 80s synth Stranger Things sort of way. Kind of action-y. I think it sounds less intimidating though.
Word?
Chapter 1. Tragedy has this opening guitar riff. It's grungy and dirty. It says, "Do you really want to go into this mansion, bitch?" And then right as you enter the mansion, it enters the section where you hear this bit. This is a really good build-up, and it's all spooky and oppressive, and it hits you with the reality of how horrifying this situation is. The remake track is a lot more upbeat, adding in elements of rock and funk. It kind of reminds me of House of the Dead Overkill mixed in with, I don't know, some Castlevania, maybe a little bit of Virtual Cop, just kind of smorgasbord of different feels. This theme kind of has a more triumphant feel to it. I think it has a little bit less atmosphere than the original track. There is this really cool section where they add in the main motif from the original theme. At least it tries as hard as it can to reference it without outright being it. but it doesn't have that same spookiness that the original theme had. The equivalent section here just doesn't strike as much fear into the heart. Chapter 2 just kind of comes in and assaults your ear holes with this banger. It's a fusion of gothic sounding Halloween music with retro 90s synths and samples from the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. We don't talk about that part. Anyway, let's vibe for a sec. The new track is clearly trying to follow along, but I think it's a lot more subdued and not quite as aggressive. It actually weirdly reminds me a little bit more of the opening to Cowboy Bebop, at least this first section does. I don't know, totally different vibe, but I can still see how it's trying to pay homage to the original, and it's pretty cool. I think this is the track where I can see the most inspiration coming from the original. Chapter 3 is quite a banger in the original game. Yeah, it's pretty repetitive, but it's got a sick beat. And I don't know, man, I'm just vibing over here to the spooky Halloween whistle. The remake version, I don't like as much. You can hear references to the original, and for a split second at the very beginning, it sounds exactly like it's gonna lead into the exact same song, but it doesn't. It just kind of goes in its own direction. The vibes don't hit quite as hard, but I do like this one little section here where things get a little spooky. All right, to quickly run through the rest of these, Chapter 4 is decent. I'm not a big fan of the boss fight theme in the new game. And the magician theme is trying really hard to sound like the original, and it does a pretty decent job, but it just does not reach the same levels of hype. I'm sorry. So yeah, that's the situation with the music. Now that I've talked about those 3 core ingredients, it's time to touch on everything else. Chapter whatever the fuck, let's talk about everything else. Okay, let's talk about the reload sound real quick. In the original game, you would only hear this sound whenever you tried to shoot and there wasn't a bullet in your chamber, but here, the game yells at you the moment that your clip empties, and it's really fucking annoying.
Reload! 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 Ah! Reload!
I'm also not a big fan of the sound effects that the score counter makes. The boss fights. they're not as good here. Fundamentally, they're similar to how they were in the original game, but I swear, Chapter 2's Hangman takes way more bullets to go down than he ever used to, and the Magician he goes on for way too long. They also turned down his speed, so he's just kind of wimpy looking. There are scripted sequences in the game where your bullets won't damage bosses or enemies, and those were present in the original game, but I feel like here, that window has been expanded and it's a lot harder to get shots in, meaning these boss fights end up taking longer, sometimes twice as long, usually because of a combination of the control issues and just the tighter windows to get shots in. This often applies to enemies too, like this one that refuses to die until his animation is finished. In the original, he's just standing and you just shoot him. I don't know why they changed that, but it feels really weird and I never got used to it. Okay, so to get into some of the more positive stuff, we have extra modes and features. There's a new Horde mode, which adds dickloads more zombies, and this makes the game much harder. To compensate, the game also offers you a handful of brand new weapons to choose from, including a grenade launcher and an assault rifle, which are the two weapons that I use the most. You have to have a perfect run where you save every scientist in every level in order to unlock these though. And once you do that, you have to find these chests and shoot them, which they're not the easiest things to get. I had to do some research in order to accomplish this, but eventually I got it done. This feels more like a post-game reward than a feature, because by the time you've already saved every scientist, you've kind of mastered the game. But also the controls make getting a perfect run extremely difficult. Luckily, you can reset each individual chapter and maintain your progress if you happen to shoot a scientist, so it's not as bad as messing up during an arcade run, but it's still not a lot of fun to miss shots. I'm sorry. Unlocking all of the weapons kind of drove me insane, but I did it. We have a gallery where we can look at updated enemy character models, weapons, and we also have an achievements board, adding some replayability to the overall experience. You can also play with 2 players, choose between 4 difficulty settings, change your score settings, put your score on a leaderboard, and adjust a wide variety of options in font that requires a magnifying glass to read. And that's pretty much all of the new stuff. As far as new content, there really isn't a lot here. An extra chapter or 2 would have been really nice, especially since there was quite a bit of scrapped content from the original game, but I really wasn't expecting anything that substantial as far as new content was concerned. Still, that extra content would have been nice given how short the overall experience is, but this achievement system is a nice addition and I think it helps the game a lot. I'm also bummed that we don't have a retro graphics mode of any kind. I really have an affinity for the classic look and I miss it. And with that, I think I've said everything that I have to say on the game.
You jumping? What is that? Nah, man, I love Freddy Krueger. I love Jimmy Crippin' Freddy Krueger and Jimmy Crippin' brother.
So what's my final verdict? Well, given that a whole lot of this review was critical, you might think that I hated the game, but that's not exactly the case. I was honestly just kind of mixed on the whole experience. The game has several issues keeping it from being amazing. But to be fair, I think a lot of these issues just stem from the game existing on the Nintendo Switch. Rumors suggest a PC port in the future, and I think a PC version would fix nearly every major issue that I have with the game. The crappy frame rate, the pop-in, the bad Switch gyro controls, and the original music could be modded back into the game. I'm sure Trex 45's tracks are going to be an extremely popular choice for modding. Once that's all been fixed, it's really just a bunch of minor nitpicks that are left over. I think the question we really need to be asking is, does this game replace the original? To me, no. I still think this game is pretty solid, and a PC port would be much better. But there's still a certain magic and charm to that original game that just isn't entirely here. I have to give the development team props. I think they made something really good and really special. It's just the limitations of legal troubles, time constraints, and probably a literal pandemic, along with the platform that they targeted. The game feels rushed, but I think the dev team put their all into it, and we'll probably see some updates in the future that optimize things a bit more. But even after all of those updates, it won't replace the original to me. And, you know, I was bummed out about that at first, but I think I've come to terms with it. Besides, I've played so much of all of these games in the last few months for the last few videos that I've made that I'm honestly kind of burned out on the series for the time being. I never expected this remake to even happen in the first place, so it's wild to see that it's here, and honestly, that alone is enough to bring a smile to my face. At the very least, I think this game's release has gotten the series and the original game into a slightly more mainstream place, and more people are talking about it again. Hopefully this awareness is good in the long run, and we'll get more House of the Dead games in the future that feel closer to games 1 and 2, because that's honestly what I'm missing personally. So that's where I'm at. Acceptance. The House of the Dead remake didn't blow me away, but once the kinks are ironed out, this will be a pretty solid experience overall, and a pretty good jumping off point for the series going forward. Maybe in VR? So if anybody who happened to work on this remake is watching this video now, I appreciate you. Thanks a lot. So the review is over now, but before I close out, I wanted to add an addendum to my previous House of the Dead video, because there were a few things I either didn't include or just outright got wrong. Listen, I was in a rush to get that video out before Halloween, which is kind of funny given that it didn't blow up until a couple of months ago. Anyway, that's what this part of the video is for. In my spin-off corners segment, I completely neglected to mention a couple of games. The first game is Zombie Revenge, a beat-em-up style action game from 1999 released on the Sega Dreamcast. It's loosely connected to the House of the Dead series and even makes references to the first 2 games and has a level set at the Curian Mansion. I don't have a Dreamcast and I'm honestly not that big of a fan of beat-em-ups, but if the situation allows for it, I'd like to give this game a shot one day. The game has a lot of the trademark camp that the House of the Dead is known for, and it honestly just looks like a wacky old good time. This was a huge glaring omission, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it up in the first place. The other spin-off that I neglected to mention is House of the Dead EX, which looks like some sort of minigame collection with a romance element. You know, I watched somebody play through this entire thing and I still have no idea what I just watched. As far as I can tell, this game is exclusive to Japan, though it may have been brought over to the US, I don't know. If I ever get the chance to play this thing, fuck it, I'll do it. In my last video, I also got a few comments regarding what I said about House of the Dead 4, and I realized that I didn't properly describe the root system that existed in that game. So it's still not very complicated, but there are some secrets to be found. I just personally didn't discover any of them during my playthrough, so I assumed that they just didn't exist at all. So that was my bad. I was lucky enough to have the chance to play a little bit more House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn. So I didn't quite get to the end, but I'm a little more experienced with the game now, and my biggest takeaway honestly is just that the frame rate is kind of doo-doo. That's a really funny thing to bring up considering what I just said about House of the Dead Remake. I feel like in this game I took a lot of unnecessary damage because of the freezes and just overall sluggishness. I also think in general that the enemies here are extra bullet spongy, even when playing with a second player, and the feel of the game has the same problems that I had with House of the Dead 4, where enemies just kind of vaporize into the ether. It also overall just seems to have a weaker branching path system than even 3 had. I also think these character models just have this uncanny valley quality to them that is also present in the remake of 1. Anyways, I still haven't properly beaten Scarlet Dawn or played all of the routes, but given the experiences that I've had so far, I'm honestly just kind of underwhelmed. None of the music that I've listened to has done much for me either. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the game. Apparently you can also emulate it on PC now, but that's as much as I know on the topic. Alright, we did it. We covered the entire House of the Dead series up to this point, minus whatever thing I probably forgot to mention. Sorry. If you watched my video all the way up to this point, thank you. I really appreciate the views and support. I'll probably never talk about this series again, at least not for the foreseeable future, although that could probably change if a remake of 2 ever comes out within my lifetime, so we'll see what happens there. If you're interested in subscribing and sticking around, I have a bunch of other fun videos coming down the pipeline where I talk about other games, largely those from Nintendo, classic movies from my early 2000s childhood, and just general video essays about media. With that, I'd also like to announce that I'm rebranding the channel, which will henceforth be known as Zillennial Dissonance, the place where I, JJ, the Zillennial, talk about media, mostly from my childhood. So if you'd like to stick around and see what I have coming down the pipeline next, then why don't you subscribe? I promise you won't regret it. Thank you to everyone who got that last House of the Dead video up to 37,000 views as of the recording of this video. Wow, I might actually get the chance to commit more time to this YouTube thing, so I can't wait to share what's next. I'll see you all in the next video.